right now is Passover, is coming up on Wednesday night in 3-4 days. And the situation that's happening right now actually really closely parallels the story of Passover. And I want to share that with you so you could begin to see really how closely these two situations are. So it all starts with Pharaoh in Egypt being hard on the Hebrews. He decides that he's going to enslave them, makes them work for him. And he has everybody convinced that he is God, to such a point where he doesn't even want to go to the bathroom in front of everybody. So he sneaks away in the mornings to the Nile to go to the bathroom to relieve himself, so that people shouldn't see that he's human, so they shouldn't know that he's human. And he believes that he's God. And the labor got so hard on the people that they cried out to God, and God heard their prayers and gave a man named Moses the task. The famous scene by the bush, the burning bush, gives them a task to free the Hebrews from slavery. So Moses comes to Pharaoh and he says the famous words, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh says, "Why?" Moses says, "Because God told me to." Pharaoh says, "I never heard of this God before. I'm God." And Moses says, "Okay, if you don't listen to me, what I'm going to have to do, and what I've been tasked to do, is I'm going to bring plagues, and the first one is blood." And Moses turned all the water in Egypt into blood. And Pharaoh wasn't really scared of it, because his people were able to turn into blood also, so it wasn't a big deal for him. Next, Moses says, "Fine, I'm going to have to bring frogs." So he brought frogs. Pharaoh again wasn't scared, because his people were able to do the same thing, but it got to such a point where he couldn't control the frogs, and he asked Moses to stop the frogs and stop them from coming. So Moses said, "Fine, no problem." He stopped him. And Moses came to Pharaoh with all these different plagues, asking to let the people go, and Pharaoh, one by one, said no. And each plague got increasingly worse, until finally one day Moses comes to Pharaoh and he says, "Listen, you know, I have to kill all the firstborn. That's the last plague in order for you to let us go. Will you let us go?" And Pharaoh says no. So Moses says, "Okay, this is the last time you're going to see my face." So the Jewish people had to take blood. They put it on their doorpost, and they took sheep, lambs, and they tied them to their beds. And lambs of the day were considered the gods of Egypt, and the Egyptians couldn't do anything when they saw the Jews taking the lambs into their houses. They were dumbfounded, and they were very upset about it. But God was making a point. He was asserting himself that that's not God, I'm God. And eventually, Egypt gave a great cry, and they woke up and they realized that all the firstborns, from the animals to the children, were all killed. And at that point, the Hebrews left Egypt, led by Moses. And now they get into a very difficult situation, because they're on one hand leaving Egypt, which served them for hundreds of years, gave them their food, gave them their livelihood, gave them their shelter, their security, it's all they knew. I mean, they weren't on a very high spiritual level. They were completely intermixed here. And they left. And they went into the desert, where there was no food, there was no water, there was no nothing. They just sort of had to trust God. And by the way, only 20% of the Hebrews left Egypt. 80% stayed in Egypt, because they're too scared. They didn't want to leave. They didn't want to leave their security. And eventually, Pharaoh decides that he changes his mind, and he says, "What did we do? Are we crazy? We let the Hebrews go. They were building our cities. They were building everything. What did we do here?" And they start chasing them. And they chase them to such a point where they're up against, talk about between a rock and a hard place. The Hebrews come to water, a body of water, and they have the Egyptians chasing them behind them, coming to bring them back to Egypt at the best, kill them at the worst. And they had nowhere to turn. All they could do was continue walking forward. And 2 Hebrews walked into the water until it came up to their nose. And when the water reached their nose and it would have blocked their airways, all of a sudden at that point, the ocean split. And the water split open, the sea split. And they walked through on dry land. And as you know, they walked through, and the Egyptians followed. And as the Hebrews left, the water closed in on the Egyptians. and the Hebrews reaped all of the gold that was in the chariots. So how does this apply to our current circumstance that we find ourselves in? How does this fit with where we find ourselves today? We live in a world that is dominated by a Pharaoh. That's everything besides God. And we are enslaved by the world. We're enslaved by our work. We're enslaved by our phones. We're enslaved by our mortgages, our taxes, our rent, our schools, our everything, our memberships, our dues, our fees, all these things were our pleasures. And we're enslaved by our pleasures. We're enslaved by all these things. And here comes God and says, I want to liberate you. And I want to bring you out, and I want to give you freedom. And you say, whoa, 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 freedom? I don't want your freedom, your definition of freedom, God. I'm happy where I am right now. I'm enjoying Egypt. I have my 3 square meals a day. Yes, Pharaoh is a tyrant, and yes, it's slavery, but hey, it's all I know. And God says, you know what? Too bad. And he gives what's called in Hebrew a makkah, a plague. And slowly but surely, he starts unwinding all the freedoms that we thought that we had. Right, one by one. It's not like everything melted away here, guys. It's not like, from one day to the next, we found ourselves all in our houses in isolation that we couldn't move. We have systematically been confined to our houses. And now, our houses, what do they represent? It represents leaving Egypt and going into the desert. There's no livelihood in my house. There's no, in Hebrew, parnasa, livelihood. There's no way to earn a living here. There's nowhere to go. And furthermore, the way forward is so scary, I cannot see a future ahead of me. I cannot see when this thing is over what the world is going to look like. It almost looks as if there's an ocean, there's a sea, and if I move forward into that sea, I'm going to drown. And God is telling us, don't worry. Don't worry. Please trust me. I took you this far. I took you out of Egypt. And now I'm bringing you and the world into a new place. And all I'm asking you is to walk forward and to put your foot, one foot in front of the next. And we say to God, whoa, whoa, whoa. If I go any further, then it's going to go up to my nose. God says, go. And the message that we're supposed to take from this is if we keep on walking forward, one day at a time, the sea will split and we will walk through dry land and everything's going to be okay. It used to be, before this whole thing happened, it used to be that people would give 25-year mortgages, right? They're giving mortgage relief now. You can now push your mortgage off for 3-6 months. And the banks, why? Because they'll give 25-year mortgages. They had such confidence in 25 years. Today, people don't have confidence in 25 days, let alone 25 years. So we have to live in the moment, one day at a time, one foot in front of each other. And although the future looks impossible, when we trust in God, the sea is going to split for the whole world, including yourself. We're going to walk through on dry land and leave, finally, the constraints of Egypt. God bless.